Is there any scenario where a single one of you would walk into a dojo or walk into, let's say, a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu gym and ask, where are the peer-reviewed studies to back up what you guys are doing? Now, in the process of trying to put this channel together, I have to do a lot of research. Now, I wish I could say that research is spent trying to expand my horizon and increase the amount of knowledge I have with regards to training and programming, but it is actually for marketing. I have to go through a lot of the popular channels, see how they structure their thumbnails, what types of keywords they use, what topics they talk about. Yes, it is a manipulative marketing strategy to get you to click and watch my videos, and I feel horrible about it. But the fact is that YouTube only gives me about this much screen space to compete with, and I'm going up against thousands and thousands and thousands of other videos. So it doesn't matter how good my content is, if I don't check the right boxes and if I don't play the algorithm game, all of my content will be banished to YouTube purgatory. So in the process of trying to figure out best practices when it comes to putting together a viable YouTube channel, I end up noticing some things about this field in particular. And one of the trends that stood out to me was the prevalence of science-based training recommendations. There are a handful of channels, and no doubt you can think of them off the top of your head. These are usually channels that are headed by people with better than average physiques, usually nothing exceptional, usually not high performance accolades or a really deep coaching background, but they do have an advanced degree. And these people, through optimizing the YouTube algorithm metrics and doing things to increase watch time, and by selling their role as an authority using their advanced degree, have been able to carve out very successful niches, usually in the fitness arena, but sometimes it can even bleed over into things like bodybuilding, powerlifting, strength and performance in general. Now, I'm going to say this about 14 times in this video. This is not a video against science or a video that is anti-science. I'm going to be very clear about my definitions about what science is as an idea and where the pockets of scientific practice can fall short and sometimes lead people into false conclusions and looking up to the wrong authorities. If I go into incognito mode so that YouTube can't use my previous search history to influence future results, and if I type in science-based, the first run of things that pop up are entirely fitness related. Jeremy Ethier is at the top. He's closing in on 4 million subscribers for doing such hard-hitting pieces like the fastest bicep workout that actually works and how to reverse the effects of slouching in 10 minutes. Then as we scroll down, we have Jeff Nippard. It looks like Jeremy Ethier again, Nippard, Ryan Humiston. These are predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly fitness-based channels that all rank for the simple term science-based. This should give you insight into how a lot of these people are organizing their keywords and are organizing their titles. They know that presenting things as science-based is an effective tactic, and it should stand out that this exists in fitness industry, which is known to gimmicky bullshit, but is surprisingly absent from any other niche that might benefit from providing a science-based explanation. What these figures are actually doing is using their advanced degree and their understanding of formal academic literature to give them a sense of authority. And it works because it seems legitimate. You have people that see a physique that they aspire to, you have a cleanly put together and concise video, and you have it backed by research. The real fix when it comes to gaining muscle and losing body fat is the same advice that's been around essentially for the last 100 years, and it's not that sexy. Now, this is a perfect example of how science-based gets used as a branding tool to try and give authority to people who may not rank as highly if they didn't have those advanced degrees to lean onto. Now, obviously, this doesn't discount the information. Just because they're using their academic accomplishments to get authority doesn't necessarily invalidate the things that they're saying. But it does suggest that they have an incentive to represent one particular aspect of discovery when it comes to figuring out how to train and what best practices are. Now, a lot of us know the people that take this and run with it. You can think of the extra gimmicky stuff that people do. There's some study that shows standing on a vibrating plate can increase muscle activation by such and such a percent. Next thing you know, you have vibrating plates being sold by people marketing it as the next big thing.
When you're on the whole body vibration machine, the vibrations are acting as your resistance.
And this is clearly a problem because it shows how you take a little piece of information, a small piece of truth, and flesh it out way beyond the boundaries of where the study should allow you to take it to. And then you could take that, stamp a brand on it, and sell it, and all of a sudden you're made in the shade. Now, how many world champions have been built by standing on vibrating plates? How many world record performances? How many breakthrough physiques? The answer is absolutely zero, because in the context of the real world, when it comes to application, there are so many other variables that are more important that it's not even really worth talking about. But if you fixate on these studies and you're in the business, if you're incentivized to extrapolate more truth from them than the parameters of the study will actually allow, that's a problem. Joel Seidman is another good example. He's a PhD. He's known for speaking in convoluted riddles that are not made to increase communication and understanding. It's actually made to take simple things and convolute them so that he gets to retain his position as authority. Because if you don't understand it, it must mean that it's over your head, and therefore you need him to show you the way. And then he can charge way too much for books that are filled with a bunch of useless stuff that no real good lifters actually use in practice. Now, the big people that you might also think of on YouTube are the Jeremy Ethiers, the Jeff Cavaliers, the Jeff Nippards. These are all people with degrees that push the science component hard. These are the people whose videos pop up when you type in that term and who have amassed a disproportionate amount of followers than who you might think should get those followers. In what other field would you have all of the attention going to people who aren't exceptional in their field, haven't coached anybody who's exceptional, and who have a pretty run-of-the-mill education? And while they might have physiques that appeal to the average person, the fact is that each of them is just barely to the right of a bell curve where 2/3 of the left end are completely sedentary. Their main feature is low body fat, and Jeremy Ethier and Jeff Cavalier both look like middle distance runners who do a couple sets of bicep curls on the weekend. All of these people have amassed millions of followers simply because they leaned heavily on the science-based approach, even though that lean is completely absent from the best coaches, the best lifters, the overall best performers. Now, guys, I got to walk it back on my man athlean-x a little bit. In the process of trying to find clips and titles and thumbnails that illustrated my point, I actually found a lot of the opposite on his channel. He addressed this problem specifically and seemed very reasonable and measured about his approach.
You probably know a member of the PubMed posse. It's a growing posse, and it's one that needs to be sort of have their legs cut out before it grows too large. That most of this research is being done on college students. And finding subjects, reliable subjects, is one of the most difficult things that any researcher could ever do. And one guy goes off and gets absolutely freaking tanked that night. And then the other guy, who knows, he goes and he finds out what Pornhub is for the first time in his life. He never even shows up the next day.
Now, if any of you know anything about my personality, you know that the fact that he is hated by so many people, pretty big incentive for me to get on Team Jeff. So I might have to do an athlean-x deep dive. Real quick, guys, if you did find any of this helpful, please subscribe. Please hit the notification bell. I appreciate everybody's support. We've been growing exponentially, and your support allows me to make more of these videos. So thank you. Loosely, there's a distinction between hard and soft science. The idea being that hard sciences are concrete. So a hard science, you're going to find easily definable variables. They're easily observed and measured. They fit mathematical models. They're easily reproduced, and they give very predictable results. Examples of this that lead to strong conclusions are things like astronomy, chemistry, and ultimately the backbone of those fields, which is physics. Soft sciences are a little harder to get a handle on, harder to define variables. A good example is in psychology. You have to define things like human emotions or certain behavior patterns. That leaves a ton of play in the joints, and you can potentially get some bad conclusions if you are not very careful with how you make those definitions. Harder than defining it is measuring it. Similarly in psychology, how do you measure things like sadness or depression? How do you measure conscientiousness? Those are very difficult things, and what ends up happening is that the person doing the study finds some proxy for that quality. And at that point, you're already making more leaps to assume that measuring this one thing is actually an indicator of this other thing. And often with a lot of these research studies, you get a lot of conflicting results. This is very common in things like diet and nutrition, in the medical field, when you're trying to establish what causes cancer or how certain lifestyles might influence things like high blood pressure. And of course, these fields do include psychology, sociology, exercise science, and it's really anything else that leans heavily on trying to study in very concrete terms the human being. We are very complex, especially when it comes to our individual anatomy, when it comes to our genetics, when it comes to our brain and the way our minds function. We ultimately get farther and farther away from what we might find are actual meaningful statements that we can put into action in our day-to-day life to get a better result. And that's kind of the point of science, is to get a good enough handle on the physical realities around us that it gives us the ability to make predictions about what will happen given X, Y, or Z.
Now, defining science is surprisingly hard because there's no standard definition everyone agrees on. But most people would probably agree with this. Science is systematically observing natural events, then using those observations to develop laws and principles.
All right, so formal academic research basically aims to make our observations as good as possible and make sure our interpretation of those observations are as good as possible. This represents kind of the gold standard when we engage in a randomized double-blind study. A perfect example is something like a placebo group when it comes to administering a new drug and measuring how it affects cancer in two different populations. You are going all the way down to the level of the psychology of the patient, trying to limit as many things that will potentially bias or alter your data. You're trying to control for as many variables as possible so you can measure purely these two different things. Now that's great for the harder aspects of science where you can define and isolate those variables very effectively. As we start to have systems that are more complicated, where each variable is more tightly connected to this spider web that consists of many other variables that are maybe hidden, maybe they're harder to define, maybe you can't isolate them all together, then we run into some trouble. Now, the example that I had given in my other video was about volume, and I showed all the different dials. If volume is set at one place, any effective coach is going to make sure that the number of reps, the percentage, the effort, the frequency, the exercise selection are all arranged in a way that makes that viable. And if you change that volume dial substantively, you are going to be doing your client a disservice if you don't change anything else. But that's how these studies are done. So if, for instance, on the volume curve, let's say the number of sets drops dramatically, for there to be an adequate stimulus to continue growth, it is strength training 101. Either the number of reps need to go up, or the amount of effort needs to go up, or the frequency needs to go up. Maybe you move to different exercise selection. There has to be something to accommodate to make sure the stress is high enough to grow. Now, to complicate this spider web of variables, because this is just a few, there are a lot more. To complicate this, we have to take it out to the most annoying dimension for us, which is time. Over time, the environment changes. That doesn't exist in physics, that doesn't exist in chemistry, at least not to this degree. We are adaptive machines. You expose us to a stress, we go from little skinny stick guy to somebody who's yoked out, right? It's just like building a callus on our hand. Now, you don't continue to build a callus from yard work if you do the same amount of yard work. Eventually, you get a sufficient amount of protection, the stress becomes inert, and then your body just registers the stress as another day at the office. You don't continue to adapt to a minimal amount of work that you've already adapted to. So the question of strength training is, how do we continue that adaptive process? And because formal research is extremely limited and we don't have that great of an ability to really make meaningful conclusions about all these different variables, they end up leading to really bad questions. Things like, what's the optimal rep range? What's the optimal number of sets? What's the optimal amount of effort? What's the optimal range of motion? It's like asking, how long should a piece of string be? It doesn't make any sense.
You want to know exactly how many sets to do each week to get the job done best. Well, guess what? You're in the right place. You're asking the wrong question. You see, you probably shouldn't be asking that question specifically without asking yourself some other questions first. Are you natural or are you enhanced? What is your experience level? What are you training for?
For you to give a meaningful answer to that question, you need a lot more information. You need to start with other assumptions. And because we have so many potential starting points, it's completely impractical on the face of it. There are a lot of things that work. They all have their own sets of rules, and they can all be followed effectively as long as you abide by them. So with all strength training, we start with some stress that kicks us out of homeostasis, and we get this exponential curve. As we adapt to that stress, we get newbie gains, right? And then eventually we level out. Now, if you don't change anything, that line continues and you stay in plateau purgatory. The real thing that we are concerned with when it comes to training is figuring out how to plan for this stagnation and restart that new S-curve. To do that, you need something that's periodized. You need to organize your training over a longer period of time to adjust for the fact that we adapt to whatever it is that we do. And that is strength training 101. That is the first thing I would teach in any class on this subject. It is conceptually very easy to understand, and no amount of training you do is going to work long term if you don't do this. So acknowledging the fact that we do adapt and this happens, how the hell then do you reconcile simple one-dimensional questions like, well, what volume should I do? That question is entirely dependent on what you did before. Now, Ethier said something specific. He described himself as a kinesiologist.
Now, the way I amassed all of the subscribers and got all of this publicity is actually very simple. By staying dedicated to only providing fitness and nutrition content that is 100% backed by science. I take this approach because as a health professional and kinesiologist myself, I value science.
Which I had to try not to laugh at. And again, I'm not saying that there isn't utility in these fields or that they are void of any educational value, but as an institution that represents the cutting edge of our field, kinesiology isn't even close. And it's something that people aren't going to recognize unless they're close to the field. I took the first year of kinesiology at Cal State San Bernardino, which is actually known for its kinesiology program. That's when I thought this was going to be my career. Well, eventually did become my career. But I figured out very quickly that you don't need to go in debt and getting a degree if this is what you want to do. Personal training is easy. All you need is a certification. And if you work for yourself, you don't even need that. What I found quickly is that what they offer to the kinesiology coursework is either things that you can find through a year's worth of muscle and fitness subscriptions, or things that go above and beyond that and offer a bunch of trivia that really doesn't offer any changes or any action that you can make to your approach that would be meaningful. And a lot of the guys that come out of that field will flex by trying to rely on that trivia to give them more influence and authority than they actually deserve. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is, can you apply a viable stress to your client that gets a predictable result? And that involves your tableside manner, that involves your communication with your client, that involves being able to troubleshoot, that involves having a wide database of exercise in your head, and the experience that will give you insight into how that's going to work. Beyond that, you just need to know how to make it sustainable. That is something that you're not going to get, not even remotely close, from any formal academic research that only exists in the field. To give you some insight on some of the stuff that really turned me off to the kinesiology program in particular, I took classes like Introduction to Kinesiology, which was worth half credit, but basically the feeling I got was that it was to make you feel better about the coursework, because there was this stigma going around that it was a degree basically in physical education. Which it is. You go the pedagogy route, you do that because you want to teach, and that's the avenue for teaching, is physical education. So they were trying to do like a PR bit to push back against that unfair labeling of kinesiology as being just a degree in PE. And I found it to be a complete waste of time, and it almost had like this insecure vibe to it. Like, chemistry doesn't have to do that. You know, the mathematics department doesn't have to do that. I took history to kinesiology, in which you learned really interesting facts like the Greeks played sports. Psychology of kinesiology was one of the most infuriating, because I was going into that really hoping to get insight in performance psychology and things that might be helpful when I go to train or when I'm coaching other people. The standout bit of information that I could actually sink my teeth into was what most people already know, and that's just an inverse relationship between intensity and precision. So the harder you go, the less precise you are, and vice versa, right? If you try to throw a dart as hard as possible, you're much less likely to hit the bullseye. If you want to be precise, usually aggression has to be very low. In most sports, the center where those intersect, that's called the zone. And that's where we try to get to psychologically. I'm not kidding. We spent 45 minutes. The professor took out Play-Doh, gave everybody Play-Doh, and made us make the graph three-dimensionally out of Play-Doh. It was 100% filler work. It didn't make any sense. You could tell he didn't come prepared, or maybe he did think that was a great conceptual learning tool. I have no idea, but it's an idea that takes about 2 seconds to explain, and it took up an entire class in a course that's a few $1,000s to take. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. That just soured me. I could tell that there really wasn't anything to sink your teeth into until you got to the upper division stuff, and most of that was going to be made up of, again, a lot of trivia that doesn't make you a better coach. Now, we just went over a lot of the pitfalls of formal research, of where what we consider the gold standard of scientific execution, things like double-blind randomized studies, can actually be very, very limited if you reach a certain threshold of complexity. There are going to be times where the best scientific application actually doesn't happen in a controlled laboratory study. That's where we have to look to other schools of thought, to other methods of learning that aren't quite as fixed and rigorous, because we have to allow for more play in the joints and more variability, more organic discovery if we want to keep the thing we're trying to study intact. It's very often that you get different schools of thought and learning that contain a lot more robust information and have actually accomplished a lot more because they don't confine themselves to the suffocating limits of formal study. Here's a perfect example: mixed martial arts. Is there any scenario where a single one of you would walk into a dojo or walk into, let's say, a Gracie jiu-jitsu gym and ask, where are the peer-reviewed studies to back up what you guys are doing? The idea seems ludicrous on its face because we have a very, very old method of doing something that has been proven in the field over and over and over. We had our sample size. All of the MMA fighters in the 90s, we had them go through a sieve to figure out who had the best methodologies. And at the end, we were left with a few interesting things. Those that knew how to wrestle and grapple or do jiu-jitsu were much better off. Those who were complete were the best off. And eventually that transformed into mixed martial arts. And now there is absolutely no doubt what is required to be the best martial artist. This is a form of science. You already had an incentive to make the best possible product you could. That incentive basically consisted of winning a tournament. If you win a tournament, you stick around, you go on to future fights. The things you did right get preserved and passed on into the future. If you were biased, or if you were an ideologue, or if you stuck to bad methods, you got your ass kicked and you were never heard from again. But nowhere does any piece of mixed martial arts have any technique to credit to formal academic research. That doesn't mean it's not valid, and it doesn't mean it's not scientific. It just means that the most robust, meaningful information could not be isolated in a lab setting. Maybe at some point in the future, you'll be able to clone people into 1,000 versions of themselves and run through all kinds of hypotheticals with a bunch of people in lab coats taking notes. Maybe you'll be able to do that one day, but that day isn't now, so we have to meet reality on its own terms. So I have to say this again, this is not a call against science. Science is a system of trying to find the truth by creating rules that give us insight into how the world works. This is an appeal against science being used as a branding tool to give an undue amount of authority to people who overstate the importance of flawed and limited data. If anything, this is an appeal to keep science honest. It is communities within science that can become biased or corrupted or lazy in their methodology, because when you are trained as a hammer, everything becomes a nail, and it's important to have other perspectives. Our primary concern is to be driven by getting the right answer. That's it. We want to know if we put in X into this system, we get Y. We don't want to have to guess. And it's not always straightforward that the easiest way to do that is through formal academic research. When that's the way things line up, that is a gold standard. But for now, that's so far away that it's not even worth talking about. Formal academic research is not the cutting edge of strength training. It has never been, and it likely will not be. Now, rationality, empiricism, critical thinking, these are all still very important. You still have to be as rational as possible and try to remove your own biases away from your evaluations. But as long as you can look at a population of people that have experienced something similar, threads of common principles that run across the best performers, and the same basic methodologies being passed forward generationally as they continue to produce world champions, we can be pretty sure, just like a mixed martial artist would be pretty sure, that their methods are rooted in fact. So my advice to you is to put all of your attention in the field. Take notes, use yourself as an experiment. Everything you might learn from formal research, you have to apply to yourself anyway, so you might as well cut out the middleman and build your own relationship of trial and error. So that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know what you think. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.